Let me start. First of all, welcome everyone to this. It is really a pleasure to be here. I'll explain why in a second. So my name is Vijay Rangarajan. I am Director General in the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, and I deal, among other things, with global health, with gender inequality, and of course with climate change. And hence this series of webinars as part of our COP26 presidency to explore the issues around agricultural innovation. I've just come back from being ambassador in Brazil, and I'm delighted to see a colleague here from Embrapa. And I know that country and others who I think will be of incredible interest in this work very well. And one of the things that has struck me has been both the incredible scale of the challenge of agricultural innovation, we all know the challenges ahead, the sheer number of people that we need to feed, the way that we need to do so in a way that provides the right calories to people. And we're seeing epidemics almost of some of the non-communicable diseases, and particularly diabetes and obesity, at the same time as we're seeing deep and even worse deficits in food for many of the poorest in the world, which has got so much worse over the this COVID period. So we have to change the systems. We have to change them in a way which decarbonize, which stop deforestation, which support development. And I want to linger, because you all know more than I do on those first. I want to linger a little more on support development, because many of the poorest and most disadvantaged people in the world, and the ones who will be preferentially harmed even further by climate change, are of course poor rural farmers, where the combination of change and lack of investment and technology is an enormous burden for them. But it is also an area where there is incredible hope and possibility here. I have seen farms in India, in Brazil, where productivity is of a scale that one would never have believed before. We all know some of the absolutely incredible examples which have been done ever since the Green Revolution and onwards, the agricultural revolutions, technologically and socially, which have taken place in countries across the world. No more so, I think, than the two I mentioned, India and Brazil, but plenty of others across Africa, for example, have gone through their own revolutions. But there is so much more that can be done with the technology, with the investment, and with the cooperation that we all can bring to this. So just to take a step back, this series of webinars is to try to look at, obviously, the technology. It's to catalyze thinking and cooperation around this critical climate, agriculture, nature, health set of issues, all of which are clearly interlinked. And I think having a zoonotic disease like COVID come and hit us recently has brought that into even sharper relief than normal. This is part of the COP26 Nature campaign, transforming agricultural innovation for people, nature, and climate. So how do we, and these are the questions obviously you're all here to answer, how do we actually catalyze this and speed up the rate of change, the scale of change? That is, I think, a fundamental issue. How do we share best practice, technology, innovation? How do we create new technology and innovation? I remember vividly, and I'll leave you with this, a visit to a farm in the central Brazil, in Mato Grosso, where productivity was 7 times even the surrounding farms, which were already pretty good. It was also took much more intensive and took far less area to produce the same amount of cattle. And those cattle were fed a particular feed additive, which we produced, which also drastically reduced their methane emissions. If you put all that together, the amount of carbon emitted and the amount of profit per head of cattle was infinitely higher. I mean, I think we were, not infinitely, but it was about 7 to 8 times higher. Incredibly powerful. How do we share that around the world? How do we actually get wide-scale take-up of some of these absolutely fundamental agricultural changes, translating those into the food systems themselves, translating that into real development for the populations concerned and hence for the whole globe. I think that is our fundamental challenge. I think we begin today with one of these evidence reviews as we look at the flows of public and private investment. We will then go on in subsequent meetings of this into looking at the performance of agricultural approaches in low and middle income countries, the gaps, and as I say, how do we scale? We'll then come back to look at the linkages between biodiversity and agriculture, food and nutrition. And then further on, rethink the way we bring innovation to scale and deliver end-to-end innovation around all of this. And then finally, look at, as always, one comes back to the money, the investment gap. How do we transform food systems? Thank you all for coming. I think this is a really important set of conversations, and I look forward to being a part of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you very much. And nice meeting you virtually. I hope
and you.
In the future we can meet in reality. So I really thank all my panels from the Commission on Sustainable Ag Intensification, FCDO, CCAFs, and I really thank all the participants. I understand that we have hundreds of participants today, and I'm pretty sure you won't be disappointed. We have a great panel ahead. So just a minute to say that we at the Commission for Sustainable Ag Intensification, we are trying to build a portfolio of evidence. It's all about evidence these days, right? So we want to have this evidence to support more and better investment in innovation in the Global South. Now we are working on 5 things. One is that is going to be presented today. How much is being invested? That's a good benchmark to have. We are also trying to estimate the funding gap, how much would be needed. We are working on metrics to make sure that over time, organizations and all of us will be able to say, well, we made it, or we are so far ahead. Without those indicators, it will be hard to know if we are transforming or not. We're also working on pathways for innovation, good examples, cases. What happened in India or in Brazil or in Kenya or in some other places that really was successful. And finally, what are the instruments? What are the mechanisms? Can we innovate also in the way that we finance innovation and so on? So anyway, the commission is a time-bound commission. We are ending at the end of the year. Lots of work ahead in the next few months. I'm sure you will hear from us. So again, we are very, very pleased to partner with FCDO and CCAFs on this great series of webinars. And we have a great panel ahead. So I won't take much more time because I want the panel to really answer great questions that are coming to us. But before that, I invite Nirat from Dalberg that is going to present one of the foundational pieces of evidence on how much is being invested. So with that, Nirat, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruben. And good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, based on where you're dialing from. I'm Nirat. I'm partner at Dalberg, based on Delhi office. Very pleased to present key findings from the study that we've been working on along with COSI over the last few months. Over the next 8 minutes or so, I will walk everyone through the top level findings from the study, the key patterns that we've discovered as we've analyzed investment flow. But I want to start out by saying 3 things fairly quickly, just to provide some context on the way we carried out analysis. First, for our study, innovation was defined fairly broadly. It was not just technical innovation. It wasn't just R&D. It included all the other investments that are needed to help scale up those innovations. Sorry, I'm just going to share full screen. So that's the first sort of thing to keep in mind. The second is that our frame of analysis was the entire Global South, and we looked at funding from 3 different sources. The first source was public investment, the second source was private sector investment, and the third source was development sort of actors. And then finally, the time frame for the analysis was the last 10 years, from 2010 till 2019. We did not look at 2020 because there's some data that was still missing. So with that being said, let me sort of jump right into the presentation. Can everyone see the screen clearly?
Nirat, you'll have to go to presentation mode. It's still not on presentation mode.
Okay, sorry, 1 second. Is this now okay?
No, we're still seeing the same, Nirat.
Okay, 1 second. My apologies, just 1 second. Is this now full screen?
Yes, you're right to go now. Over to you.
Great, sorry about that. So let's jump right into this. The first sort of big takeaway is that on an annualized basis, between 50 and $70 billion is being spent on agricultural innovation for the global south. This is only about 4.5% of the total value of agriculture in the global south. So it's a fairly small fraction. If we look at where the money is coming from and where the money is going, so on the left-hand side, you see the sources of this investment. On the right-hand side is where this money goes to. So the first thing that's fairly clear is that a very large fraction of this, nearly 70% of this investment is coming from the public sector. Between 35 and $45 billion. The second largest source is the private sector, which spends about $20 billion on innovation every year. And then we have development partners at about $5 billion. And PE, private equity and venture capitalists come in with about $1.5 to $2 billion. From a recipient category perspective, about a little less than half goes to government and private sector, public sector units. Research and universities and research institutes also are about 15 to 20%. And then most of the money that is spent by the private sector goes into the private sector itself. So that's about 20%. If we now do a double click on the different sources of funding, so this slide talks about the patterns in public spending, public sector spending. While public sector accounts for about 70% of the overall innovation spending, what's interesting to see is that three countries, Brazil, India, and China, they account collectively for almost 60% of the government spending overall, with the rest of the countries accounting for the remaining 40%. From what this money is used for, again, a fairly interesting pattern is that what is typically understood as technical R&D only is about a quarter of the spending. And the remaining 75% is actually towards adoption of this innovation. So investments in extension, investments in marketing and behavior change, but also investments in institutional and infrastructural spending in these countries. Coming to the private sector spends about $10 to $20 billion every year on agricultural innovation. A very, very large fraction of this comes from large companies as opposed to investors. So 90%, you'll see on the graph on the left-hand side that 90% of this is coming from mostly large corporations. And the sectors, the subsectors where this money is going to, this innovation money, are primarily three. So there's a lot of money that goes towards farm mechanization, then pesticides, and then finally seeds and seed development and biotech. Meat, poultry come next, and then everything else then aggregates into about 24% of the spending. Coming now to the development sort of partners and their funding patterns. Collectively, as you can see, about $5 billion are spent on agricultural innovation annually. Bilaterals account for more than 70% of this $5 billion. With multilaterals and philanthropies making up for the rest. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, a fairly interesting pattern emerges. R&D and sort of technical innovation accounts for only about 10 to 12% of this entire spend. This used to be a little larger around 2010, 2011, when this ratio was 18%, 17%. But over time, this ratio has shifted more towards scale-up funding. So there's a lot more money going into the scaling up of innovations as opposed to purely technical R&D. One of the key analyses that our study carried out was the amount of money that was flowing into sustainable innovation for agriculture, not just innovation overall, but sustainable innovation. And we used a 5-dimensional framework to look at sustainability. What's interesting to note is that a very small fraction of money actually goes into sustainable innovation when we look at the intentions that have been stated. So only if we look at the broader definition, about 6 to 7% of the investment, agricultural innovation investment, is going into things that either have an environmental sort of gain, sustainability gain, and either social or human gain, right? So less than 7% is truly sort of meeting all these sort of criteria. If we look at only environmental sustainability intentions, then about 4% of the agricultural innovation spending has a very clearly stated intention of environmental sustainability. So these are fairly low proportions. And the pattern doesn't shift too much by the source of money. So development partners are actually the most proactive in this sense. Between 8 and 10% of their investments in innovation have a very clearly stated intention on sustainability. But on the other hand, if you look at the private equity space or the venture capital space, less than 1%. In the private sector, the range is quite broad, 4 to 9%, and governments is in the middle with 3 to 6%. So this is a clear sort of finding, and definitely needs a little bit more focus going forward. Coming to where is this money going from an agricultural ecosystem perspective? So our study sort of split up the agricultural ecosystem into 3 different layers. The macro layer, which looks at governance, systems, policy improvements, financing, knowledge systems, etc. Then the core activity of agricultural production, that's the layer 2. And finally, production factors management, natural resource management, water, soil, biodiversity as layer 3. What's interesting to note is that a very large fraction of the funding, more than 50% of the innovation funding, goes into layer 2. And less than 20% of this funding goes into layer 3, which is water and soil management, biodiversity management. Again, something that should be kept in mind when targeting more investments. Finally, we sort of conclude by saying that there are 3 opportunities to at least invest better in agricultural innovation and to drive sustainability. First is we need to increase the overall funding for agricultural innovation. Right now, only about 4.5% of all the agricultural sort of output, the agricultural innovation spending accounts for less than 4.5% of the output. So that itself needs to increase. Number 2, like we've seen, less than 7% of the agricultural innovation spending is clearly sort of signaled, has clearly stated intentions around sustainability when measured through these different parameters we've defined. So there's an opportunity to improve that. And finally, what we discovered through this study is that there's a clear opportunity to improve the way reporting is done on both innovation investments in agriculture, but also sustainability sort of investments in agriculture. Different standards exist across the world, different level of granularity exists, and oftentimes it's very, very difficult to piece together a coherent picture. And with improved reporting on these things, a more transparent view will always be available to direct investments going forward. So those are the 3 sort of big opportunities. I know I'm almost out of time, so I'll pass it back to you, Ruben.
Thank you, Nirat. Fantastic. This is a great start to our panel. We start with some evidence. Finally, we are getting some numbers and some surprises. So I'm sure that we will have plenty of good discussion coming forward. Thank you, Nirat, for that presentation. Very clear. So now we move to the panel. And so I have a few questions, very easy questions. One, I will start with Vara, my colleague Vara from the Commission. He's in Kansas State University. He is the big director of the Innovation Lab on Sustainable Ag Intensification, nothing else. So Vara, the report concludes that, as we just saw, that perhaps 7 to 15% of all innovation funding includes any stated intentions around environmental issues. with this percentage dropping to under 4%, we also look for all the other investments that include social or human objectives and so on. It's very surprising. How can we bring together science, technology, policy, new financial instruments, institutional capacity to address all of these multidimensional issues with such a small amount of funding, particularly around climate change, which is the topic of the day? Thanks, Vara, for being very short on your answer.
Thank you, Ruben. This report is very timely. I'm really surprised and concerned that only 4% of the investment is going into the innovation space of sustainable ag intensification. This number is extremely low considering the status of poverty, hunger, malnutrition, and progress towards sustainable development goals. We must take this serious and take some action to improve this situation. I hope that COP26 and UN Food Systems Summit provides this opportunity. New innovations in technologies are needed not only in productivity and economics, but also other domains of environment, human condition, and social aspects. We have many innovations and products that address some of these components. What we lack is an understanding of trade-offs across these domains and the impacts, which impacts the decision-making. It is a lack of adoption of our technologies at scale, which is one of the major barriers. This can be solved by bringing together innovations in technology space with targeted efforts in creating enabling environment and building social capital. This means we need innovations in policy, financial instruments, methods of scaling, science of adoption, understanding the barriers of adoption, and building social capitals. I'll give you some specific examples. Number one, we need creative policies and their implementation to provide timely access to quality inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, or mechanical tools that are affordable. We need new financial instruments for credit and loans, insurance policies, and safety nets to minimize risk to both farmers and credit organizations. We need innovative ways to link producers to markets, create new markets, and enforce policies that will ensure profitable procurement price for all commodities to all producers that ensures equity. We also need innovations in value addition to products to address nutrition and health, and technologies to minimize post-harvest loss and improve food safety. Finally, we also need improvements or provide entrepreneurship and business opportunities for all, but primarily to women and youth. All of these will require co-creation, co-development, and collective action from all stakeholders with a common agenda to support innovation and build social capitals. Fortunately, there are some success stories. One of those examples is building social capital through creating social groups such as farmer self-help groups, women cooperatives, farmer field schools, youth support groups, and innovation platforms. When these social groups are linked to markets, credit organization, and technical programs, they had better opportunity and bargaining power that provides a platform to support each other and leverage additional resources. When this happens, private sector, businesses, markets will see them as opportunities and will invest. Such groups can also create political will and support. I will end this by saying that these empowered social groups can work with scholars to improve agricultural productivity and environmental outcomes to address food security and climate action. I hope that answers your question. Thank you, Ruben.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Vara. Well done. And thanks for being very efficient with time. So I move now to my colleague and friend, Mauricio in Brazil. Mauricio, we have a great start because the previous UK ambassador to Brazil started this meeting talking about your beautiful country. So in your view, and you are coming from research and you've been managing research and, anyway, from your view, what are the three key aspects of how the public and private sector have invested in the Brazilian sector that has made that country a global leader in innovation? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ruben. My compliments to Director Vijay, who I had the chance to meet many times when he was ambassador in Brazil. It's really nice to see you, Ambassador. Also my colleagues in the panel, participants from around the world. It's really nice to be here with you. Well, Ruben, we can identify several important landmarks in the process that made Brazil one of the major agricultural players in the tropical belt of the world. The most important factor was certainly the decision of our government in the early 70s to pursue a science-based model of agricultural development. The scientific base for agriculture in the tropics was quite limited at that time. To overcome that, Brazil invested quite heavily in institutional building and also in training of human resources. Embrapa, the largest agricultural research organization in Latin America, was created at that time. Thousands of young researchers were sent abroad for training. The second aspect, in my view, was choosing the right agenda. The investment in institutions and in human capacity allowed Brazil to carry on an agenda that helped the country solve its problems in a relatively short time. We have been able to build the fertility of our soils, which are very poor. We have tropicalized the diversity of crops and animal production systems. We have developed and adapted many sustainable practices, such as no-till systems, nitrogen fixation, integrated crop livestock forests, among many others. Director Vijay mentioned some interesting things he saw in Mato Grosso. Well, and the third aspect, Ruben, is that all the public investment in agricultural innovation worked as an attractor of private investment in Brazil. By successfully embracing the high-risk endeavor of developing advanced agriculture in the tropics, the country mobilized the private investments to agriculture, which amplified many times all the public investments and efforts made by our governments over the years. In summary, Brazil is, I think, a very interesting case of a productive alliance between public forces committed to science and innovation and a huge diversity of private forces or enterprises that took advantage of the most severe limitations of farming in the tropics being removed with public research, policies, support programs, and to put really their investments in motion. So in a nutshell, Ruben, I think these are the reasons why Brazil has become, in only one generation, a global leader, both in agricultural production and also in agricultural exports.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Mauricio. Very sharp answer. Perhaps we can go back in the questions at the end after a second round on the panel to go back on that the big issue that Nirat showed us today. Like apparently, there's much more investment in scaling up. And for those of us who've been in this business for some time, in order to scale up, you need something to start with. And Brazil apparently did it right, investing in public research. And now there's a lot to scale up in Brazil. So it will be nice to go back in the questions and see if the balance between investing in public and private R&D is enough, according to Nirat's numbers, related to the scaling up issue. Anyway, thank you, Mauricio. I move now to also my colleague and friend Uduak from the Commission. And Uduak brings a fantastic business perspective into these topics. So very, very brief, Uduak, the report that we just heard from Nirat points out that almost all private sector funding in innovation is from very large companies. But despite the lower sums of money involved, innovation by small and medium-sized enterprises, the ones that many agencies are trying to promote, the SMEs, could also be also the micro enterprises could be also very important. What are some of the factors that we need to consider to promote that, to influence innovation investments in SMEs, not only in the large multinational or national companies? Thank you, Uduak.
Thank you, Ruben. So first and foremost, I wouldn't say the SMEs are not investing in innovation. I think they are. Based on my interactions with them, they are. It's just that the SME sector can be very fragmented, and it's really difficult to harness the information that lies within that sector. Also because they do not document things very often, and they might be very difficult to engage, especially if they're not clustered. So there are a couple of challenges, some of them very common to us, that the SME sector face as far as investing in innovation is concerned. I think one of the most significant is the lack of information. In countries like Nigeria, where I reside, there is a strong deficit in the number of extension agents that are available to interact with smallholder farmers. We are experiencing numbers as low as 1 extension agent to 500 farmers. And so that means that information from research agencies and institutions on the new technologies or innovations that could be adopted by farmers trickles down really slowly and really poorly to this SME sector. So that's it. So the first thing is that they do not have access to the right information. And when the information does come, it doesn't come in a timely fashion. Most engagements around promoting innovation happens at a very national level. And even when they are written into policy documents, that doesn't necessarily get domesticated at the subnational level. And then even beyond the subnational level, then being trickled down to rural communities where you have SME and smallholder farmers really being strong actors. So that's one thing. Another thing is there's a lack of research and development within the SME sector. The investment is just not there because in most cases, they do not have access to the right finance. They don't have access to finance to be able to invest in research and development. And then also they do not have strong ties to partnerships where they can take advantage of research and development that has been established or funded through other mechanisms. So access to finance is a strong inhibitor for SME investments in innovation. We also see government policies sometimes being inhibiting investments in innovation. Sometimes those policies are in place, but they're not implemented. And so the SME sector sometimes are not even aware. So then again, we're back to information that these policies exist. And then even where they are, when they are aware, these are not policies where they were consulted or engaged in the process of development of those policies. And so if these policies are not such that are easy for SMEs to implement, then that becomes an impediment. Also, we see a general lack of incentives for the SMEs. Like standards are put in place, they are not closely monitored or enforced, and I'm investing in this innovative process or technology, and there is no it doesn't make business sense for me if my competitor doesn't make the similar investments, which means at the end of the day, I mean, businesses are here to make money. And business needs to be competitive. And so if there are no incentives in place, then there is no encouragement for investing in innovation. We need to have systems in place where incentives are put in place, can be taken by small businesses, not just the large ones, because most often where you have incentives in place, only the large companies are able to take advantage of those incentives. Thank you, Ruben.
Wow. So we have a good, thank you, Doc. We have a good set of potential recommendations here. I'm happy to hear all of that coming from reality, what's going on with businesses. Thank you very much. So I go back to my, you panelists have done so well that you can be resilient, and we are going to go for a second quick round on the same order. So of questions, and then we open for other questions and issues. So Vara, coming back to you, traditional donors, those donors that we cherish a lot, for example, in the CGR or in US land-grant universities and many others who have been consistently funding research and innovation, apparently make up a relatively small proportion of the total global funding, about 10% of innovation funding or innovation spending. Can this funding be catalytic? And how can we ensure it has long-term impact how we can engage a bit more with those traditional donor funding windows to promote this catalytic effect on innovation. Thanks.
Great question, Ruben. This report clearly showed us that the national governments are by far the largest investor in innovation spends, about 70%, followed by private sector at 20%, and remaining 10% comes from the traditional aid agencies, non-governmental organizations, and foundations. These include the bilateral, multilateral, and philanthropic organizations. Despite the small percentage, these funds are extremely important to universities and national research centers. They serve as a catalyst and stimulates the entire innovation system. These investments should be very targeted and should prime the research enterprise to ensure that we have a pipeline of innovations. In my humble opinion, these funds should be targeted towards three major areas. First, research, scholarly, and creative activities and discovery to find solutions to societal problems. Second, build institutional capacity in terms of research facilities and equipments and infrastructure that will support innovation. And third, build human resources in terms of well-educated and trained workforce that will serve research enterprise and build the necessary social capital. Now coming to what type of research? These funds should focus on transformational research and groundbreaking ideas. Ideas that are high risk, but can give us high returns. Those ideas which government and private sector are not willing to fund or take the risk. In addition, these funds should also support activities that are underfunded or not supported by either government or private sector. They're not profitable. Generally, these take longer time to have an impact. This report has identified few of those items. These include, for example, innovations in soil, water, biodiversity, and natural environments, innovations in policy, trade systems, and financing, innovations in post-harvest storage, transport and processing, and food safety. We need to ensure that focus of these catalytic investments is on innovations that are useful not only under current conditions, but also to future challenges and emerging threats. Now to quickly answer the second part of your question, which is related to how can we ensure long-term impact? The focus here should be on building in-country and local capacity and ensure that they are self-sufficient. The emphasis should be on journey to self-reliance. This will require scholars and donors working closely with the host country partners to ensure that it supports their strategic plan, goals, and objectives. This ensures that research can be sustained with the support of government and organizations in the host countries once the project or the program ends. Last but not the least, one of the key requirements for all of these efforts is going to be proper tracking, monitoring and evaluation, and use of common framework, principles, indicators, and metrics. We also need to ensure that data on innovation spends is transparent, properly tracked, and accessible. Research data should be made open access. Some of these items are highlighted in the report. Hope this addresses your question. Thank you, Ruben.
Yeah, thank you, Vara. You know, it's music to my ears when you talk about strengthening national research systems. So, and it goes directly to my question to Mauricio. According to the report that we just heard from Nirat, China is a big investor. Brazil is a big investor. Public research funds explain 60–70% of all of this funding. But these are only two countries. What happened with the other countries? I mean, if you add India, you add many others, we still have 10, 15 countries investing and the rest. So, Mauricio, how do you think we can improve these partnerships, these investment partnerships between national governments, private sector, ODA, and other investors, capital markets, and also regional. There are economies of scale in public research. You know, in Latin America, there is a regional fund, or in Asia, there are many other initiatives. Can we do something together, or we are going to see the Chinas and the Brazil and the Indias continue to grow, and the rest of us just looking the train go by? Mauricio, all yours.
Yes, Ruben, this is a great question, a challenging question. And I think taking some risk, I'll try to answer it, maybe centering in two concepts, my answer, the concept of complexity and the concept of complementarity. I think we are in a terrible need of better narratives. And I think the study that we are just discussing here is providing us with a very powerful data and numbers to improve our narratives, to get more attention from policy and decision makers. More attention and investment are needed if we are to face the growing complexity in the world of food and agriculture. And I think many people are not really aware of it. I think it's quite clear now that we are immersed in what can be called an era of complexity. Today, many dimensions that impact the world of food and agriculture are interconnected or interdependent. We are talking about the climate crisis, but also we are concerned about the nexus: food, nutrition, health, well-being. These and many other things are all linked, requiring a systemic way of thinking, integrated innovation strategies, and a lot more investments than what we have now. In your question, you mentioned my country, Brazil, and China, which are two interesting cases in which public investment in agriculture innovation is working as a cleaning track train, if we can use this comparison. I'm talking about narratives here. It's always good to use these figures, these images. I think they convey strong messages. In many countries, public sector investment works as a locomotive that moves ahead of things, with the governments embracing high-risk research programs, putting in place policies and support strategies. It creates the condition for the private sector to find, say, cleaning tracks, so to speak, to safely put in movement their wagons or their investment. This is, in my view, the best way to build the complementarities that are needed now and that will be needed in the future, which are necessary to face the growing complexity in agriculture in the global food system. The sustainable intensification agenda promoted by COSI is totally centered in strengthening evidence and supporting a more systemic view of innovation, stressing the need of more investment and cooperation of multiple players, as we are discussing here. So bottom line, Ruben, considering the challenging reality that we have emerging ahead, governments, private sector, and other investors operating in isolation will not be capable to produce impact. And we can't forget that complexity will only increase. And if we don't find a way to reinforce investments and cooperation, to build complementarities, we will be certainly in trouble as we become pressed to face realities that are more and more challenging. So I think this is the challenge that we have ahead of us. We have to think more about stronger narratives to convince the right people that more support is needed if we are going to face the immense challenges emerging in front of us.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I still think I fully agree with you as usual, but I also think that there is a lot of space for much more cooperation in public research regionally, at the regional level. You know, my little country, south of Brazil, won't be able to invest the amounts that Embrapa or China. So I think there's a lot to do on cooperation in public research at the regional level, I guess. But anyway, we are short of time, and I have one more question for Uduak, and then we go for just opening 3 or 4 major questions that are coming, and then we close on time. Uduak, the private sector funds about, according to the numbers from Nirat, 15 billion annually on ag innovation. 50% of those funds are on things that we know: crops, machinery, seeds, pesticides, biotech, great science, and half of that on marketing. What do you think about that mix for private sector contribution to livelihoods, environmental outcomes, all the things that you see, for example, in websites of these major companies? Is this a well-balanced portfolio?
Thanks, Ruben. I think this is something that has come up time and again now that we are having food systems dialogues happening at the national level. And I think the reason why most of these large corporations get away with only investing in these sectors that ensure that, you know, they are more and more profitable is because no one is holding them accountable. We do not have adequate systems and structures in place that would assess the extent to which these investments are impacting, you know, the environment and also having socioeconomic impact on the communities where they are being made, and also guidelines that would guide the actual activities and investments of businesses, and then also the systems in place that would enforce whatever those guidelines are. And I mean, there has to be some penalties in place for going outside of those guidelines. So this investment, you know, these percentages are quite skewed. And we are, through the Food Systems Summit dialogues, advocating for increased investments in climate-sensitive agricultural practices, in biodiversity management, just the way it's been presented here on the slides. And we have discussed what the roadmap should look like, and we are hoping that at the end of this food system dialogues process, that businesses would be able to offtake the game-changing ideas that have come through the systems, these dialogues, and make the necessary investments that is required of them. And that there has to be an accountability mechanism put in place so that after a couple of years, we can come back and assess the situation again and see if things are being done differently. And if not, then what are the consequences? Because there have to be consequences in place for people to do what they need to do. And so these are the things that we really need to think about. These investments are inadequate, and we need to engage more, advocate more, and put the signs on the table to show the businesses that diversifying these investments also makes business sense for them. That way it's being viewed as a win-win situation, and they are more encouraged to do what we require of them, which is to make investments in climate sensitive agriculture, and also ensure that any investment takes into account socioeconomic impacts as well.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I'm sure we have to also look at the market incentives for companies to do that. Thank you, Doc. Very good. So we are 10 minutes to the closing. I thank everybody again for staying with us for 10 more minutes. Don't go yet. This is one of the best parts is coming, which is the end. So I go back to Nirat. Nirat, your earlier report, a little more than half an hour ago, if you still remember, created all of this conversation. So I come back to Nirat from Dalberg with a question coming from the audience, that we heard that only about 6 to 10% of funding has intentions related to the environment. Can you explain a bit more about what that means? Thank you, Nirat.
Thank you, Ruben, and thank you for the question. Our study focused on a fairly detailed parsing of investment records across all these spaces. We parsed literally hundreds of thousands of records, and we relied on the stated intentions of that investment. So did the intention very clearly state an environmental sustainability effect or a social sustainability effect? And that's how these numbers were computed. Now, clearly, intentions sometimes can undercount and sometimes overcount outcomes. Not all intentionality always leads to that outcome being realized. And clearly, sometimes the way investments are written up don't always capture all the benefits of that investment. So these two things in our mind balance out. But what's incontrovertible is the need for placing intentionality around environment much more firmly in the investment sort of processes of different sectors, and shining a light on the effects of the investments. So hopefully that answers the question, Ruben.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I want to clarify, these are not planted questions. So thanks for your answer. So Mauricio, you know, we all know about the amazing success of Brazil. It's a powerhouse, as China and India and others. But we also hear other things from Brazil. We read in the press deforestation, burning the Amazon. Anyway, a lot of soil depletion by giant soya farms and so on. Anyway, it's innovation. We have only a few minutes, I know, and this is could be debated. But is innovation in Brazil also trying to address these environmental issues?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think most of the public investment going into agriculture innovation today is really to help even the private sector to face the challenges ahead. We see emerging now the concept of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. We see agricultural systems and the food system incorporating more and more metrics for sustainability, life cycle analysis, and so on and so forth. It's not only the government in Brazil that is aware of the need for us to move towards a more sustainable systems, but also the private sector is more and more engaged in bringing more sustainability to their processes. And you see a lot of things on the media. So Brazil is quite visible because of the Amazon. The problems in the Amazon are not exactly a problem of agriculture. Those are problems with the police, because there are people cutting forest in a very illegal manner. Most of those bad things happening there are not happening by the hand of farmers or companies dealing with agriculture and agribusiness, because Brazil has an agriculture that is immersed in the large value chains around the world. We know that we have to move faster towards sustainability, and I think there is a strong movement in Brazil trying to bring that about. But unfortunately, you see a lot of bad press around the world. And I consider this, Ruben, on a spike in this trajectory of Brazil, a trajectory of 50 years. So we have to look at this trajectory and see that, yes, we've done things in the past before sustainability was such an important matter worldwide, that we are trying to correct now, we are trying to fix now. But I see a bright future for sustainability in Brazil and for sustainable intensification of our agriculture.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I have one more question, perhaps Vara or Uduak, we can pick up, and then I have just 1 minute to close before we all go. You know, I'm living in the US now after spending a beautiful decade in Colombia, and I see here trillions of dollars going into the right investments on public health, thanks to COVID, courtesy of COVID, a lot of science investments, a lot of this. Is anything, you know, we've been saying for 40 years or more that the public research is underfunding, that national capacity had to be built, but the rates of return are very high. But despite all of that, apparently, there is still a lot of underfunding, with the exception of a few countries. So is there anything we can learn from this current crisis that we're still trying to get out of from public health or the investments in science, in terms of risks, public investments in complex issues, public-private partnerships? Is there anything that we can bring home to sustainable ag intensification from the current pandemic? If you know, Bara, perhaps you can have a word or two, and others if they want to close. Any other great thoughts you may have in 1 nanosecond, that will be much appreciated. Thank you.
Great question, Ruben. And COVID-19 was just one example of an animal disease moving into human and causing a havoc with more than 3 million people dead. So, but it really reiterates the need for science. It is fantastic that we were able to mobilize the resources and have a vaccine in less than a year, and then it has been distributed around the world, which is a significant step. And this could not have happened if the infrastructure and the science was not funded in the past. So I think moving forward, we need to make sure that these research organizations are well funded so that we are well prepared for any such future pandemics like COVID-19. And associated with that also was this brought us the lack of inequality or equity issues. So we really also need to address those issues as we move forward. We need to be preparing ourselves. So what are the future threats, whether it comes from crop diseases, animal diseases, and then climate change. So we need to be really proactive and prepare ourselves so that we can be more resilient and address these issues when they come the next time around,
Sure.
because they're going to come.
Sure, thank you. No, we need to be very, very clever on the way that we present these, for example, to the forthcoming Food System Summit and so on. So let me close by thanking SCDO, CICAS, and of course, my colleagues in the Commission for organizing this. I would say that the report from Dalberg clearly outlines underinvestment in innovation in sustainable ag intensification. We are looking forward not to say all the things that are not going well. We want to provide from the Commission clear evidence on so what are we going to do about it. So there is a webinar in this series coming soon. I think it's number 5 after today's, talking about the funding gap. Now that we have a benchmark, how about estimating that funding gap? That will be a nice discussion to have also, together with the metrics, together with examples and a few other things that we are preparing in the Commission. So stay tuned. I hope that much more evidence is coming. I really thank my colleagues in the panel for being awake early or late and participating, and for all the audience for great questions. We have much more questions as usual, good answers. But anyway, stay tuned, and thanks again for CICAS and FCDO for organizing this. Much more is coming in the pipeline. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.